So the next thing I'm going to do is fit the swing arm in here, and then we're going to drop the motor in. The motor has been test fitted in here once before. I'll show you a quick picture of that. Now that we're a little bit farther along, that was a rough fit. Got the bottom end all rebuilt. It's in primer right now, and so I need to make sure I get all the sprockets lined up and get all the spacers made. So before we paint the motor and scratch it all up, we're going to go ahead and put the swing arm in. The rest of the suspension, we're going to get the motor fitted and line up, and we'll make the spacers. You can assemble this rear end in several different ways. I find it easier to go ahead and put the shock in now. The bottom shock bolt's tight. The pivot bolt on the bottom of the rocker arm is tight now. The top just has the bolt in it. You can see there's no nut on it. But I find that's much easier than trying to get it all into the swing arm later and get them all tightened. But you can do it however you want it. Anyway, swing arm goes on next. Swing arm's on now. Linkage is all installed, tightened down good. There's no nut on here yet because I got to slide it back out, but this is all good and tight, no free play in it. So let's go ahead and set the motor in. So we've got the KX500 bottom end bolted in there right now. Kind of walk around. Should be the other side, a little bit better light over here. As you can see, it's the bottom end was all sandblasted down to bare aluminum, and then we primer it with a green aerospace aluminum metal etching primer. Anybody who works in the aviation industry will recognize that ugly color. That's not the final color, but that's the primer we're using. So you can see there's a little bit of space here between the back of the output shaft bearing and the front of the swing arm. Right now we're slid all the way to the left side of the bike up against that swing arm bearing. And we're going to put the sleeve in for the sprocket, put the sprocket on and line it up with the rear sprocket. Make sure we're over far enough. It actually looks like, well, we figured we'd have to come over farther. The cases have already been bored out a little bit larger because the swing arm pivot bolt in the 450 is bigger. So they've been reamed out. You can see when you come around on this side, there's a bit of a gap there. So we've got some room to move the motor to the right, but we don't have any room to move the motor to the left. And generally, when we do these conversions, we have to do a little more machine work to the case on the left-hand side to get it farther out. But we're going to go ahead and put a carrier in here and a sprocket and a disc and line those up to see how they fit. One of the things to take a look at is you can see that when this is installed, there's just tiny bit of space between that case and the front of the swing arm. However, the clutch cover goes on real nice and everything works. This particular quad's getting an electric start kit, so we will put the Kickstarter back in it, but we're not going to put the kickstart arm on. We'll take a look at it and see what it's going to take to extend the shaft out so it can be kicked easier on the bike. But at this point in time, it's going to have an electric starter, and so all he's going to have to do is push a button. So let's go ahead and get the rear end in and line it up. Don't know how well you can see that, but I have a machinist straight edge clamp to the sprocket, so it's square with the sprocket. Got this front sprocket on with the factory spacer and the nut snug down. And I'm on the inside of the rear sprocket, and if I line up with the outside of the front sprocket, I'm exactly the width of this ruler, which is 1/2 inch, this steel rule, and the sprocket is just a tiny bit over 1/4 inch. So basically, this sprocket has to come out, and that sprocket has to go in. So what we're going to do is we're going to custom make some spacers for here to move the sprocket out a little bit, and then we're going to make an adapter here to move the sprocket in, and then we're going to double check all that and make sure it lines up. I could machine a little bit more off this inside of the motor and pull the motor this way. However, the motor is already about 3/16 of an inch this way in the frame, and I don't want to move it over too far, because when I get the electric starter kit on, I don't want it to hang out here way past the frame. And I've got plenty of room for my clutch cover on the left hand side now. So I'm going to go ahead and pop those covers on before I make the final spacers for the rear, but I'm pretty sure I don't want to move it over. If I do, I'm only going to move it about another 1/8 of an inch. Got the machine work all done. We did a little bit of machining on the sprocket hub to move it back in just a little bit, and then did a little bit of work on the sprocket. I don't know how well you can see it, but we're on the inside of the rear sprocket here, and this one is now right on the inside of that front sprocket. Ended up doing a little bit different approach than I originally thought. Let me take you around over here. I didn't want to move the motor over any farther. You can see the electric starter is already starting to stick out a little bit, but when we come around here to the clutch side, you can see the clutch side is actually clear inside the frame, so I didn't want to move the motor over any farther. So I ended up just going over to the lathe and the mill and making a sprocket. And what I did was I built a sprocket that was wider, and then you can see where I dished out the inside, so that moves the sprocket out about 1/4 of an inch. I ended up doing that for 2 reasons. Number one, I wanted to move the sprocket out, but number two, it gave me more contact with the splines, because I was a little worried that there wouldn't be enough splines and would want to strip that out. But anyway, so we've got a little bit more work to do. I was noticing we're a little bit too close to the frame down there. You can see right there. I've got to take a little bit of material off. And then now that I have everything set where I want, I can go ahead and make the spacer for right down here. So I'll go ahead and machine that spacer, and then I'll pull the motor out. I'll clearance that spot for the case, so then I can set the motor back down in and make the front motor mounts. Alright, here we have the motor mocked back up again. Went ahead and threw the cylinder on. This isn't actually the cylinder for this bike, but it's one that I've got laying around here that I use for mock-ups, and you can see I use it for covering things up while I'm painting. Anyway, so we have the motor in, we have the fuel tank on. This is a really nice feature of this fuel tank. There's a nice little notch there that gives us plenty of room to clear the spark plug and gives us a place to put a head to stay. Did go ahead and use a late model KX250 intake boot on this one with the big Lectron. The carb's at a little bit more angle than I would like, but Lectrons don't seem to mind that too much. But the original 450, the carburetor intake came out of right here. So you can see we're down just a little bit, but if you run this straight out, it's going to be a little bit lower than it was, but it still should hook up back to the factory airbox. And with that angle, that puts us right about where we want to be. So that should be decent there. Now, we need to build front motor mounts, and we can move the front of the motor up or down. The rear, of course, is trapped by the swing arm bolt, and we did machine up a nice little aluminum spacer there, so everything's good and tight. We're into the frame. But one of the things that we want to make sure of is that we're not going to drag the chain too heavy across the swing arm. So I've elevated the front of the motor up enough so that I can get the sprocket up. So as we swing the motor up this way, the sprocket gets higher, because what I want to make sure of, that in the full droop position, the top of the sprocket and the top of the back sprocket, even though this is a pretty small back sprocket, they're all in alignment, and this bar is just barely resting on the swing arm. That means in the full droop position, the chain will rub on the swing arm just a little bit, but as soon as you put a little bit of weight on, the rear will move up and take the chain off of the swing arm. If I tip the front of the motor down, I get a little bit more, angle on the carb farther up, which I don't necessarily want, but it would line up with the airbox a little better. However, it would drop the front sprocket down and make the chain drag on the front of the swing arm real heavy, and it would just wear out rubbing blocks and wear holes in the swing arm. So that's pretty much where I think we're going to end up with the motor. I'm probably going to end up making a billet intake manifold for this, so I can move the car back a little bit and bring the angle down. When we get the motor in there for the final time, it's all painted and ported and everything, then we'll do the carb last. But what we need to do right now is we need to build a front motor mount. Since this is not a 4-stroke and this is not a counterbalance quad motor, we have all kinds of room in the front. We're going to need a lot of room here for the KX500 pipe, but moving the motor up gives us a little bit more room there. We're going to reuse the original factory mounts down here, so I'm going to have to get those broken bolts out. But we're going to pick up the factory mounts and we're going to build a mount to come up to here. I am going to build all of that out of steel because it's a KX500. It's going to weigh a little more out of steel, but it's going to be stronger. And then I'm going to step that up to a 10 millimeter bolt instead of an 8 millimeter bolt because it's going to have a lot more torque on it with a quad. So time to pop the tank back out of the way and cut some motor mounts.